Hello there, Chicuz.
Welcome to Chicuz Radio, where two cousins share their journey of self love, personal growth, and adulting in general. We are your hosts, Chelsea.
And Aika, inviting you to join us in this week's episode. Tara, let's make Chica! Welcome back to the show! Hello, Chicas! Hello, Cuz! How are you?
Hello! I'm good. Di pa rin ako makapaniwala na pang ilan na ba natin to?
Episode 4 na! Grabe, ang bilis, di ba? Woo!
Parang di pa
Sobrang
rin ako
amazing.
sanay. Hindi pa rin ako sanay.
It's called commitment. Yes, I'm so
Yes.
proud of myself. We made it
Episode
this
4.
far!
Mhm.
Anyway, what are you grateful for this week?
Oh, okay. So, what I'm grateful for this week are my rest days. So, this week is actually the teacher's break in our school. So, it's our rest days, and I'm glad na I'm glad and I'm super, super thankful na I had those rest days because now I have this energy to start preparing for the upcoming summer classes and the school year. So, thankful ako kasi I was able to allow myself to rest. Na
Yay!
I know na we have a lot of things na pinoproblema ngayon, pero still I allowed myself to rest, and now na-regain ko yung energy to prepare to go back to work by Monday. So there. How about you? What are you
Okay,
grateful for?
this week. Okay, so we're recording this the week na pinalabas ang French reunion. So
Oh my God.
that's actually one of the things I'm grateful for because Friends will always be a special sitcom for me. Grabe talaga. And anyway, that's for another topic. So, Friends reunion is one of the things I'm grateful for this week. And my friends in general who are very, very supportive of me na talagang they listen to the podcast. So, sobrang, even though we're very madaldal in this podcast, they listen all throughout. So, I'm really grateful for having those kinds of friendships. Friendships that allow me to feel safe and to just be myself and to be vulnerable, which is our topic for
For
this
this
episode.
week.
Yes, vulnerability. Since we're talking about vulnerability, we need to talk about Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown, because this topic wouldn't be possible if not for her and her book and her research about vulnerability. So, if you don't know her, meron ulit pa trivia. Dr. Brene Brown, as what she described herself in her TED Talk, she is a researcher, storyteller, and part of her research is about shame and vulnerability. So she has decades or more than decades of work and research that just talks about vulnerability. And if you're wondering, her TED Talk and her famous book is called Daring Greatly. So you can go to YouTube and watch that, or you can buy the book.
And we can also share the links with you through our community page in Facebook.
Yes, exactly.
So if you want to, para hindi na kayo mag-search sa Google. If you want an easier access, you can go ahead and visit our community page, join our community page rather, and to watch the videos and listen to the podcast that we had with Oprah.
Yes, it's very, very insightful. Sobrang, we love her and Oprah. If you guys haven't noticed yet. So, ayun nga. So, what is vulnerability for you, cousin?
I really love. what Brene Brown said during her podcast episode with Oprah. She said that daring greatly and vulnerability is not about winning nor losing. It's about having the courage to show up and be seen. And what I love about how she defined vulnerability, or what I really love about what she said, is that she had this positive approach in vulnerability, that vulnerability is a brave thing to do, and showing yourself or your vulnerable side is a brave thing to do. Kasi 'di ba, we had, I don't know if it's just me, but
I think it's most
before,
of us.
yeah, before I thought that vulnerability is something that's negative, is vulnerability is a weakness. Like, as you mentioned during our first episode, na when you were little, you believed that crying was a sign of weakness, that you grew up knowing that it was, it was a sign of weakness, and our grown-ups would tell us to stop crying. And because of that, we thought that it, since it's something that we had to stop doing, it's something that is not good.
Yes.
When in reality, we were just crying because we didn't know how to express our emotions in another way. We had no other, we had no other idea during that time how to express ourselves, and we were just literally crying for help. Vulnerability was our language because we didn't know how to again, we didn't know how to express ourselves in any other way. It was just us being vulnerable.
Yes, I completely agree because when we were little, we were open. We are open to all our emotions. We're not afraid to take risks. We are just jumping into the uncertainty. We don't know what will happen when we cry. And actually, Brene Brown also has another quote about that, which is I'm going to read from her book.
What's the title of the book?
Okay, the book is called Daring Greatly. Masyado siyang mahaba pero you just say that Daring Greatly. That's the title of the book by Brene Brown. And then this is from chapter 2. She said, "Yes, we are totally exposed when we are vulnerable. Yes, we are in the torture chamber that we call uncertainty. And yes, we're taking a huge emotional risk when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But there's no equation where taking risks, braving uncertainty, and opening ourselves up to emotional exposure equals weakness." Di ba? Ang
See,
ganda.
ganda. I really have to finish that book.
Same. Actually, hindi ko pa rin siya tapos. Pero it's really what we're talking about. That when we were kids, it's our, as you said, it's our language. Vulnerability is our language. And there's no way that it's actually a weakness.
If we weren't vulnerable when we were kids, we wouldn't be able to eat. We wouldn't be able to get, like, they wouldn't know that the water was
Is
hot in
hot.
the in the shower, 'di ba? If we didn't allow ourselves to be vulnerable back then, baka wala tayo dito ngayon. And it still applies to us as grown-ups. Vulnerability still applies to us as grown-ups, believe it or not. I know I've been there before, na sobrang ayoko magpakita ng vulnerability, but there are a lot of benefits.
Yes. And I'd just like to add, aside from vulnerability not being a weakness, we also have this myth that vulnerability is oversharing. Na iyak ka lang ng iyak, yun na yung pagiging vulnerable. No, that's not true. Vulnerability is not about oversharing. It doesn't mean exposing everything about yourselves to everyone. It is having the right boundaries and sharing our feelings and experiences to those who deserve it. So it is sharing our feelings with the people we trust. So for example, when you meet a new friend, you won't tell your deepest darkest secrets at the first time you talk. You're going to share what you did today or what you're planning to do on the weekend because you don't have that foundation of trust yet. If meron ng gano'n, medyo dangerous 'yun. 'Pag meron nagsabi sa'yo ng deepest, darkest secrets nila, medyo take a step
During the
back.
first meeting, no?
Oo, medyo take a step back because vulnerability is not really about oversharing. It's knowing when to share it and who to share it with. Yes, so that's another one, another misconception about vulnerability.
True. I would just like to add to what you shared na um it's it's really important to have that vulnerability in whatever relationship that you are in.
Yes.
It may it be in the family, in sabi mo nga friends, and of course in your romantic relationships. Na before ako I used to be an escapist kasi I didn't want to deal with those big negative emotions. 'Di ba nga sabi mo during our first episode na kasi we weren't taught how to deal with those kinds of emotions. So, I was able to cope with them by sleeping on them or like making myself busy. Kasi I was taught na those feelings are bad. Those negative emotions are bad. So I I would need to distract myself. So I ended up being an escapist when when things are getting out of hand, when I'm feeling those big emotions that I can't process them anymore. Now with my current relationship, I'm super thankful that my partner, yes, shout out the joke lang. Um we used to fight when we were during our first years in the relationship. Parang we used to argue a lot or parang naiinis ako sa kanya kasi he likes talking about emotions. Eh hindi nga ako ganon. Ayoko nga. But I realized na how important it is pala to talk about those emotions with the people that you love, with the people that you trust. Like what you said, it will deepen the relationship. Or at least you wouldn't really consider it a real relationship if you weren't vulnerable to this person yet.
So I agree with that. And just to note, although she's sharing what you're sharing is about the negative emotions, being vulnerable is not just about the negative emotions. It's also sharing the positive emotions like
Mm-hmm.
being in love, 'di ba nga sa
Yes.
relationships. So being happy, being scared, being
I
vulnerable is like expressing all these emotions with another person that you
true.
trust.
Parang sa I think we grew up in a dating scene pa naman na parang talo ka kapag sobrang in love ka dun sa other person. 'Di ba may gano'n na parang quote unquote talo ka. So, wag kang mag-give
Totoo.
all, ganyan. So, medyo na culture shock ako na gano'n yung partner ko. Or tapos biglang ano na, naging comfortable na to express ourselves na, "Okey, mas okey pala 'to." Nakakapagod maging escapist, gano'n.
And yun nga, that's what you said, it took time.
Mhm.
Hindi siya it's a process. It really takes time. So you don't need to force yourself to be vulnerable agad-agad. And the first person who you need to be vulnerable with
Yes.
to is yourself. So you need to
Totoo.
be vulnerable inside, and you really need to be honest with yourself and be brave enough
Mhm.
tell yourself what you're really feeling and experiencing, because that's the only way you'll be able to share it to other people with boundaries. Because
Yes.
sometimes, di ba, dahil nga we're just, uh, how do I say it? Iniipon lang natin siya. And then we tend to overshare.
Mhm.
So when that happens, medyo culture shock nga the other person who is not used to it. So, yes, practice vulnerability sa sarili mo muna, and then you can practice vulnerability towards others.
Totoo. Actually, I didn't go to that through that path. Parang I had an unconventional way na
Mhm.
I was just lucky na I had a partner who likes talking about feelings. So, but because of it, I was able to be honest with myself and mas na-accept ko yung sarili ko. So, sobrang, mas minahal ko yung sarili ko. So,
Ah.
vulnerability.
Yes. Oh, and speaking of that, I just wanna like maybe summarize. Hindi pa to yung final, but just to tell why our listeners why we're talking about vulnerability and why it's very important to us is because we believe that vulnerability is how we connect with ourselves and with other people. So without vulnerability, without being courageous to be vulnerable within ourselves and to others, we won't be able to have deep meaningful relationships. All our relationships will just be shallow and will just go through life na parang wala lang, ganun. Parang, some people are really like that, na they have all these acquaintances, which sometimes they even call friends, but then when the time comes that they really need someone, they can't do it. They're afraid to ask for help. 'Di ba? Kasi sometimes that's also a sign that when we're afraid to ask for help,
Mhm.
it means that we're not being vulnerable enough. Kasi iniisip natin na, hala, baka ayaw na niya sa akin, ganyan, baka hindi na niya ako friend, or baka hindi naman talaga kami close. Yung ganon. So, yes, go on.
So, yeah, actually, tama yung sinabi mo na I also saw the importance of being vulnerable in the workplace because it builds interdependence in the workplace. And 'di ba nga, according to Stephen Covey in his book Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, you build interdependence in the workplace to be effective. Work will be easier by asking for help. And I actually learned this the hard way. So,
Oh.
wag na sana kayo. So, sana matuto na kayo from us. No, the joke lang. From me. Na, when I used to work in the corporate setup, my boss didn't like me. And you know why? It's because he didn't know what was going on in my life. That was
Ah.
his reason. He wanted to help me, but he couldn't. Kasi I was afraid to show vulnerability that something was happening in my personal life.
Mhm.
And I realized that showing vulnerability is also showing that tama ka nga, that you trust that person. And just to give a background, I used to be an executive secretary. So I really had to work closely with my boss. And because I didn't have that trust to him, he couldn't trust me back. And doon nga nagsa-start yung being able to work efficiently when you trust someone. When you show that you trust them, you build a relationship. And then they will, trust you back. Before kasi, I had this thinking na to act quote unquote professional, you have to separate your personal life sa work life mo to the point na hindi ako nag-share at least na I'm going through something pala. Kaya
Oh.
I couldn't show up sa work, for example, or like I need to take a half day, ganyan. Parang I had that misconception nga na I had to be professional. My life is put together. Walang nangyayaring something wala akong ibang, alam mo 'yun, wala akong ibang mundo, work lang, gano'n. Na I wasn't able to show vulnerability in my workplace. I wasn't able to show my boss that I trust him. So, yun nga, he wasn't able to trust me back. So now, ang galing na ever since natutunan ko yon na it's okay to be vulnerable in your workplace. It's okay to show vulnerability. I would ask for help whenever I need to.
Yay!
I sobrang big achievement yon sa akin na I would say no to things that I can't handle anymore. Kasi I swear, sobrang nakakatulong talaga siya for you to be more efficient in your workplace.
I totally agree. Sobrang gets ko 'yan, and isa pa 'to, sobrang grateful talaga ako sa team ko and sa culture ng company ko because vulnerability, we can see it in how we work sa team, at least sa team namin, that we can actually tell our boss, our managers, or our teammates what's going on inside us. Alam mo yung, okay, this is like a really good story about vulnerability. It's so we have catch ups one on one with like our boss's boss. And it's funny because, well, not really funny, but it's a good story of vulnerability because during those one on one catch ups, we can actually talk about anything. Like the last catch up, we actually talked about Blackpink. Isipin mo
Yes.
naman, di ba, how vulnerable that is. It's not even about work because it's that one-on-one is more on having that connection and feeling safe so that when you talk about work and when you talk about feedback about work, the other person won't take it personally because you're able to have that trust that, okay, we're saying this because we want you to improve, and it's not an attack. It's something that will actually help you and me and the company in the long term. So that's like one example talaga of having trust and vulnerability in the workplace. 'Di
'Di
ba?
ba?
Parang ang ganda ng ganun talagang environment in any relationship that you're able to express and just talk about your feelings.
So really, vulnerability is not something negative, 'di ba? And
Yes.
if we weren't vulnerable, di natin magagawa 'tong podcast na 'to.
Oo nga, totoo. We won't be able to do this kasi it takes courage to share this insights and yung stories natin, personal stories natin to the public who doesn't know us and who has the ability to judge us, 'di
Hmm.
ba? So it's yes, thanks vulnerability. Thanks Brené Brown.
Kasi, um, dun din tayo actually humuhugot ng experiences natin, eh, to be able to share something sa podcast, to be able to share in the chikahan. It's us showing vulnerability dun sa mga, things na yun nga, for example, things we learned the hard way, that's why we're sharing
Yes.
it to you para sa'min na
Yes.
kayo matuto, 'di ba?
Yes, sabi nga nila, 'di ba, kung ang proper wisdom is when you learn from somebody else's mistakes so that
Mhm.
you won't be able to experience that anymore.
Any last words before we end the episode or
Okay.
last sharing?
Sige, I think I'll summarize na lang muna and then I'm going to share my favorite definition of vulnerability since you shared yours earlier. So, as a summary, what we want is like debunk the myths kasi dalawa sila, that vulnerability is not a weakness and that vulnerability doesn't mean oversharing. And we also want to share the benefits of being vulnerable, which is the main thing is having deeper and meaningful connections in our relationships, in our significant others, and in the workplace. And it's also being vulnerable also helps us make art like this podcast or vlogs or paintings. It's also being vulnerable when you share the things that you create to other people. And as a final note, this is my favorite definition of vulnerability, and it's from Simon Sinek. And he said, true vulnerability is interpersonal. It's connected to my favorite definition of love, giving someone the power to destroy us and trusting that they won't use it. So, yes, I guess that's the end of our episode.
Yay!
Whew.
So that's a wrap. We hope this episode is helpful for you in any way. If you have questions, suggestions, and comments, feel free to tag us at Chicuz Radio in Instagram and Twitter.
Also, if you want to continue the conversation, head on to our Facebook group, Chicuz Radio. That's CHICUZ Radio. See you there and thank you for listening. We appreciate you. Let's make Chica again soon. Paalam!
Bye!
Bye!